it's reading Kara-Tur is interesting because it's very much not a good book. And it's not like it's a horrible, like, I feel like the Kara-Tur campaign setting really falls into the same category that like L5R has fallen into for me, where it's like many times comical, problematic, and like I'm not going to use it. Oriental Adventures is like comical, problematic, and because it's Oriental Adventures, I just make it as a tier above it in terms of things I don't want to touch again. But one thing I really like about this sort of podcast or stream that we do is that, I get to hang out with the five of you, which is really why we do Asians Represent. It's like,
we all suffer together.
Well,
like
I wasn't gonna say
family.
like family.
We share the burden.
No, I was gonna say I just get to hang out with other cool Asian people.
That's fair.
Hell yeah.
See, I made it all sentimental. Y'all were like, "Oh, we just suffer together." I wanted to just hang out.
I do think the L5R comparison is very apt though, because I see a lot of proto L5R in Kara-Tur, since I was a big L5R fan when I was
That's why I brought it up.
growing up. I played a lot of the card game, and starved for Asian media as you kind of are, and that time period, it was something. But yeah, I see a lot of what became L5R in Kara-Tur, and it's not necessarily a great thing. Yeah. But
so it's an interesting thing, I guess.
Yes, it's very interesting.
I think that's why this sort of series is important, because while many folks might say, well, this book is technically not out of print digitally. This book isn't used in the current edition of D&D. Big thing with the Kara-Tur campaign setting is that there's very little mechanical work, unless you're talking about snakes, in this book so far.
Hold on. Let's roll for snakes.
Oh wait,
roll for snakes.
You could also roll for like your department and all that. But the thing with this is that the point I'm trying to make is that this book is very much something that anyone could use in another TTRPG. Right, you could see its influences into L5R. Right, you could see its influences on D&D, but also like when people just want to play Asian settings, there really isn't an Asian setting published, and this is comprehensive but not quality, right? And in the world of TTRPGs, people look for comprehensive, right? They want quantity over quality, in many cases, because like I want answers. I want to know what's in this city. I want to know the name of this merchant. I want to know these little details.
I want things that I can use to flesh out my world that I don't necessarily want to write because it's kind of tedious.
Yeah, I want like a big toolbox of things to use, but these tools are not the greatest quality. And so, one of the things this is episode 9. By the end of this episode, we will have been reading this book for just under 18 hours, and we're on page 15. So in order for us to increase the pace at which we get through this book, but also provide more meaningful feedback and content and actionable advice to folks, we decided during our Asians Represent break to do something a little bit different. So what we're doing now is we're actually pre-reading a predetermined section of Kara-Tur. So for this one, we're reading from pages 15 all the way to page, I believe it's 19. So we're reading through basically the way of work and social customs. So that's basically the social stratification of anything that's not noble in Shou Lung. So from the peasants all the way to the government officials, as well as like warriors. And then we're going to talk about religion, magic, and social customs when it comes to like fashion and things like that. That part, I will say right off the bat, was easily one of the worst parts of this section. The fashion part is very much, it encapsulates one of the biggest problems with Asian campaign settings, and it's just like grabbing awful tropes and then taking thousands of years of history and then like nitpicking. So what we did was we collectively worked on a PDF of Kara-Tur, and we left comments on it so that each of us could kind of see where we were all thinking. We then collected all of our sort of thoughts into a Notion board. So what I've done was I've taken a look at all of your comments, and I've picked out 5 key points that we could talk about today. And we could jump between the different sections of Kara-Tur to talk about these. So one, I really want to talk about, and Emma's made a couple of comments in the document about this, poor fantasy representations of Japanese feudalism as used as a tool to contrast the fantasy Chinese imperial monarchy of Shou Lung. The second one, and I know Jackie is prepared for this one because I am not as prepared for this one, is the oversimplification of Feng Shui, Bagua, and Taoism. And then number 3, Liana mentioned this one. It's this fetishization of Asian women. And that in itself was one of the common problems that we've seen throughout this book and throughout Oriental Adventures. And it's that Asians are portrayed as objects of fetishization.
Especially Asian women.
Especially Asian women.
And especially in very specific ways.
Yes, very, very specific ways.
That fashion section.
That I think the fashion section and the sort of social custom section really highlights, more so than even Oriental Adventures in a way. And then number 4 kind of ties into number 5, but I wrote how D&D's European roots and foundations make it very difficult to create, and I put this in air quotes, compatible cultures. There is a thing that I do, and I highlighted this very specifically. I think this section does one thing really well. It's literally like 2 sentences that I think this section does really well, and we'll get to that. And the second one is like, and it is that exact thing, and it's using culturally relative terms in place of European ones. And it's this idea of compatibility. And that's something that, TTRPG companies like Wizards and Paizo have to deal with. It's compatibility with their world, because there are folks, like Liana said, who buy these products and want a complete kit, want to be able to just look through, search and index and use. So compatibility is always something that's on the mind of the design team. Like I said when we were talking about Candlekeep Mysteries, for compatibility purposes and ease of access, when I wrote the Book of Inner Alchemy, I could only use the core 3 books. Because those were the books that people would likely have, rather than books that they might not have. So since we haven't been on in 2 months, I wanted to first go through those 4 common problems that we've kind of framed a lot of our feedback around. One of them we already mentioned. Asians, particularly women, are portrayed as objects of fetishization. Asians are, seen as uncivilized or in need of saving, which is kind of one that hasn't occurred too much in this particular book since it's about an Asian setting. But there are areas where they talk about how or imply that certain people are uncivilized. And Emma, you've pointed them out with the bureaucracy section here. Again, Asians are seen as violent and savage. And the last one is, and this is probably the most common one, and it's world building based on harmful real-world stereotypes and the reductive blending of cultures, ethnic groups, and even time periods. So I'd like for us to talk about them. Now, one thing that I tend to not do is read the comments on YouTube. There are many people who are really kind and leave really interesting and thoughtful comments and have discussions. One person left an interesting comment that might be a good way to start and frame our conversation. They actually commented on the episode 7 of Asians Read Kara-Tur, the bad translations one, our most hilarious episode when we looked over the writing of Shou Lung.
The writing system.
The writing system. Now, this person
the
said...
numbering system.
And listen through the whole thing, because this was actually a really positive conversation. they said, I understand getting miffed at the mixture of non-Chinese lore in Shou Lung, such as the Kirin. I think they're wrong, though, because the Qilin is a Chinese thing. But they did mention, this person said, you folks keep forgetting that Kara-Tur was meant to be as much of a mashup of the major Asian countries, just like Faerun to the west is a mashup of European cultures. This person continued to say, I mean, we have Chimera, Greek, flying around in areas where trolls, Norse, reside, who work alongside kobolds, Germany, with a green hag mastermind, Slavic, where the paladin, France, warlock, Scot, wizard, England, and the druid, Celtic, go to save captured villagers. And then they said, granted, the writers completely fucked up on this process, but it was wholeheartedly meant to originally be a mixture of such elements. And I responded by saying, you're right. The problem here with Kara-Tur, and this is where I guess we'll start our conversation, is that while they do mix monsters, material culture, just like they do in Faerun, the problem here is that they also mix stereotypes that impact Asian people today and elements of widespread contemporary religions. And I think this is a good place to start. Now, based on like our 5 points, Japanese feudalism, Feng Shui, Bagua, or Taoism, fetishization, or compatibility, where do we want to start? What do you folks think?
I want to hear Emma go off.
Yeah, do we just go in order of the sections?
We can just go off on. Let's do that.
Let's do that. Yeah, Emma, go off, please.
I just want to hear Emma. I want to hear Emma.
I noticed that a lot, but I wanted to let Emma, the subject matter expert, say her piece.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, great. Well,
I mean, you don't have to, Emma. If you don't want to.
I was kind of prepared to go in order, so it makes sense. But I did a lot of this for L5R, 40 hours of it? And
yep.
Broad summary, we're using historical stuff, but not really. And it becomes confusing and difficult to extract these things. So the whole time I was reading through this section, I'm like, what are you talking about? What is happening right now? Yeah. And I didn't really prepare any specific statements that I wanted to read out loud. Is that?
No, that's totally okay. I highlight, we all have access to this PDF. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to share this with our patrons so they can kind of see our notes as well. So there's this really... Oh, go ahead, Agatha.
Oh, so sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I could also just one of the first things that I noticed when I started reading this section is this weird way that the writer keeps trying to show the quote unquote sophistication. And I feel like the word is civilized, even though that's not specifically, I don't remember, used in the PDF, but the high implication is civilized nature of the show. By comparing it to, aka this Chinese equivalent to the Wa and aka Kosakura, which is the Japanese, and it was very puzzling. I just didn't understand why that was the case, and also it was a very interesting thing where it's you're only comparing these pseudo Asian cultures to each other, as opposed to comparing it to any European quote unquote origin, like any of the things in the base D&D or anything like that. It's instead very much oh, look at these Asian peoples, let's now pit them against each other and then only compare them this way, which I found it made me very uncomfortable, but I was also really confused, why?
It creates a strange binary. So they actually open on page 15. They actually say, in Shou Lung, there are, of course, many jobs and careers, just like in other lands. How exotic. But I will speak a moment upon these specific ways of work. For each has its own unique showness, which I thought was such an odd way of saying things. Because in my head, when they say showness, I was like, its own unique Chineseness. That doesn't make
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, I mean, so the thing to also consider, like, diegetically, is that this is all coming from the perspective of some old crabby dragon who lives in a teleporting palace.
Yeah.
And is writing
controls people with
this book for a
palace.
white dude. And is writing this book for a white dude.
And is writing this part, for Elminster. And I think that the attempt here is to imply, like, well, this dragon hasn't gotten out much, or like this dragon, like diegetically speaking, like this dragon clearly has only been to like Shou and Kozakura and Wa, and just hasn't, like, I don't know, decided to take a road trip to Faerun. But on the other hand, I kind of also, if we're going to look at this from like non-diegetically, like, what does this say about this character other than this character kind of sucks? Like, this
Actually,
character,
good point.
like this narrator, like the unreliable narrator, I think is what they're trying to go for. But at the same time, like, I don't know how successful that is. This isn't like Faulkner Sound and Fury
I can tell you how
level,
successful
like,
that is, because they tried it once before. They tried it recently again, and it didn't do very well.
Wait, where?
And that was the Sorko's Adventurer's Guide.
Oh, yeah, I forget about that book.
right.
I actually
Yeah.
feel like they're not trying to, but this is just like it's just like a different reading of the tone. I feel like the way that this is written reminds me a lot of like older, like the quote unquote classic anthropological texts, where they're very much like when they observe, like, look at the natives of this land. It's very much like from like a higher point where they're looking down and like categorizing these locals. And then the way that they do it, it's kind of like you're categorizing in the same way as you would categorize like animals and like flora and fauna.
Yeah.
Like, observe the way that they interact with each other. And therefore that's why it also made me uncomfortable, because I was like, aside from the fact that it's just false, the comparisons that are being made and the way that it relates to like real world social systems, like in historical China, like it's also like, it feels it's like that colonialism is like so strong.
So
Yeah.
it's like
so gross.
David Attenborough be like, the majestic sloth, except it's like, the majestic show.
Yeah, like it is
Yeah.
the same.
And
That's
and
pretty much
instead
the
of
feel.
David Attenborough, it's a terrible cranky dragon. And
It's-
yeah,
yeah.
Cranky Attenborough.
cranky
Cranky Attenborough, yeah.
So yeah, I think that what's happening here is like it's like, again, it's falling into that same pit trap that we've seen time and time again with this, which is like, I can see what they're attempting to do, maybe, and then again, perhaps I'm assuming in good faith here, that they're trying to like give us a dragon's perspective. Like, a dragon would most certainly see men as like not cool and like categorize them by shape and size and profession. But it's so close to real world stuff, like you said, Agatha, that like we lose that veneer of fantasy and we go straight to like, ooh, this is too real. Like the real world, like prejudices and hate that people do receive, like for how they look, etc. Like that just kind of takes us right out.
Because they talk about like when they're talking about feudalism here, there's literally a section that says no powerful noble, this is still on page 15, it says no powerful noble holds power of life and death over the farmer of Shou Lung. Instead, he is judged fairly by the magistrate of his village, appointed from afar by a wise and just bureaucracy. Which I feel like really contrasts against like everything they've said so far about corruption.
Yeah.
It's
like
Oh, for
It's,
sure.
yeah, it's just this weird tonal dissonance
Yeah.
where
Well, we know we learned a little bit about the writing process of this book when people were talking about Bawa. Remember, there was this guy who wrote all of this stuff about Bawa when he was just fresh out of high school, and they use like a paragraph. But it's like a writing team, again, very much a product of its time. A writing team disconnected with no very, very clear vision or editorial oversight.
Going back to the dragon though, because I did want to mention, just building off of what Agatha said, it feels like the dragon is supposed to be an insider and yet is portrayed as an outsider whenever it kind of suits the narrative of how they're trying to frame the culture. The dragon as presented is supposed to be a great, wise, ancient dragon within the Shou culture, and from their affect, they do seem to identify nationalistically with Shou when it suits them, but then we'll kind of take that more, high road Western anthropology view of Shou whenever they want to go negative. It's very, very dissonant in how the dragon chooses. And I know, like, the whole Shou Kozakura thing, like, it is a fact, yes, that there has been historically and even to present a lot of tension and conflict between China and Japan. The way they bring it into the book, though, feels petty.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're putting tropes against each other.
Yeah,
right.
It's like
exactly.
it's like high school football teams.
It's importing very, very real world problems and making them mean girls, which doesn't really serve any purpose in terms of either handling these real world issues with complexity or on the other hand, if you wanted to like try and move away from that and make things maybe nicer or less contentious, it doesn't really do either of those. It just kind of sits in the middle where it's bad and then it's also bad.
It's interesting. Emma, you brought up a comment because we noted that go ahead. You go ahead.
I think I know how to go about this, because instead of reading the whole section, I think the first sentence of the peasant section and the last kind of demonstrate a lot about what's going on here. So first of all, they only list 5 types of occupations for Shou, and they roughly align with the Confucian-based class system that was adopted into Japan during feudal times. So I had an overarching comment in that they're making this contrast between Shou, Kozakura, and Wa, but really the system that should be in Kozakura and Wa are based on what would have come from Shou. But like more specifically, for the peasant section, I'm like, okay, here we go. I see what we're doing here. The first sentence is, unlike the peasant of Kozakura, the peasant of Shou Lung is considered a farmer, not a serf. And then the last sentence is, unlike the serf of Wa, he is content because he is free. So first of all, we've established there's 2 feudal Japans that are separate nations. And they're both shit. And this contrast of saying like the peasant in Shou is a free farmer, it's like, well, then we have this version of an extreme serfdom that they're applying to Japan. And while feudalism was certainly a major part of Japanese history, like this idea of a serf is not quite right. And the idea of farmers being slaves, like not free, is absolutely incorrect. And I don't know what the big difference is between paying taxes to a centralized government directly and paying taxes to a centralized government via a landowner. But, in general, my beef with some of this is they're trying to, create a contrast and then sort of using history, but then just doing whatever they want with it. So, in our comments, I sort of elaborate, or in my comments on my own PDF, I elaborated on the historical inaccuracies.
You want to talk about those?
So yeah, I want to see those
Yeah.
too.
If
Yeah.
you want.
Go
See,
go off, Emma.
Yeah.
Go.
as an
Get on the
archaeologist who's
soapbox.
been like consumed by the past for so long, I lost track of what people actually want to hear about.
Oh, I
And
want.
what's just me going la 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 la.
I mean, so
I wanna
so
hear that.
as
I'm
someone
really
who
curious too.
doesn't
Mhm.
really know like about, I guess, feudal Japanese like
Structure.
serfdom
Yeah.
versus like Chinese agricultural like hierarchy, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like
Versus
Yeah.
like the Western conception, like
European
this
Conception
idea
of serfdom.
of
Yeah.
European serfdom.
And
'Cause
that's
you-
the
Yeah.
thing. This
you mentioned
is
this
really much more
Hayman-
like European.
Hayman. What's a Hayman?
Yeah. Hayman is just the general term for peasantry. And yeah, like, here's the thing. In the Confucian system for class, like, the Hayman came directly next after, like, the noble class and the warriors because they fed the population.
hmm
They were not like dirt. They were not disposable. They were absolutely necessary, and that's reflected in that class system that was brought over from real world China.
Wasn't a major currency in Japan for a while kind of a unit of measure of rice,
Rice.
and,
Yep.
and the ability
Yeah.
to feed people?
Exactly. So samurai salaries were actually paid in koku of rice. And the idea was that your salary was supposed to feed you and your family a certain amount or give you so many years worth of, I don't know,
Sustenance?
surplus. Although that was sort of abstract. So it's not like everyone was getting massive bales of rice just dumped on their front step and be like, here's your salary.
You're right.
Like, it was a
Here's
little
your-
more
here's
flexible
your
than
annual
that.
salary walks
So you
away.
could- Yeah, you'd also get paid in currency like coins and other bonds and promises, but it was equivalent to what could feed you and your family for a certain amount of time. So the highest ranking samurai were technically getting the most rice, although that was usually broken down into like gold and other things, and land. So yes, the peasantry didn't own their land. Big whoop. But they weren't beholden to the landowner in the way that some people might think. They paid taxes, but then any surplus was theirs to keep or sell in a free market. And they could leave. If their landowner was an asshole, they could leave. If a landowner or a samurai neglected or actively abused the people working their land, they would be taken to court. They would be punished by the superiors in their government system because you don't mess with the people that make your food.
As anyone has ever taught anybody,
Yeah.
don't mess with the person preparing your food.
Don't make fun of that kid behind the counter at a
It's-
fast food restaurant. You know what's gonna
Yeah.
happen. Like,
It's
Yeah.
very interesting, I feel like, because despite that saying being a thing, you see a lot of people who, in US culture especially, who love to look down on servers and food prep.
yeah,
And the way it's portrayed, it really, to me, feels like a lot of these negative barbaric traits that they're trying to apply to these Asian countries, in addition to being factually incorrect, have basis in the chattel slavery, serfdom, all of these institutions that were European and American in design. And they want to imply this level of brutality that was Western. That wasn't necessarily
and that's
Asian.
and that's
Yeah.
that's the problem and that's why I brought up one of our points of conversation was going to be about compatibility with the
Exactly.
established terminology of D&D.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Emma, the value of something portrayed as like, oh, I'm just a farmer, blah. No, but you're more than that. Because literally in the next section under merchants,
yeah,
they're like,
Yeah.
ah, the merchant of Shou Lung is more than a mere shopkeeper. He's a
Yeah.
physician healing
Yeah.
the aches and pains of the people with acupressure.
I do want to touch on the social structure of like this like the thing that Emma you brought up, like the kind of Confucius idea of like social structures, and I can say it in Mandarin. It is exactly like what Emma said. It's like the top level, if you will, are like the nobles, and I think it's in China. I think it's just like nobles or like people who can hold like governmental positions. It's Shi, and then Nong is the next one, which is the farmer class, and then Gong, which is like the
laborers, craftsmen, I think, right?
yes, labor and craftsmen, and then Shang is the last one, which is merchants. So it's actually a very interesting thing. Like in various times in Chinese history, like depending on what period, you may not be able to like get a governmental position. Like you can't take those exams if your background is like is a merchant. So that's why there's a lot of like trying to marry your child to like a different class, or like, you know, like do that kind of thing, so you can kind of like finesse your family's like societal position. And that really weirds me out that in this description of the show, it's like all of it, for some reason, it's like everyone is equal, but it's like it's clearly it's supposed to be a hierarchical society, and there's supposed to be like levels in terms of like there's like the imperial people, and then there's like people below them, but then you're saying that everyone is equal. So how does that, it just doesn't make sense. And then I don't understand, like
it definitely is a disconnect, because again, it portrays a lot of that editorial oversight. Because I think I know somewhere later in the section I think Emma mentions like the same word spelled different ways with different punctuation.
Three different ways
in the same paragraph.
And you're just like, and it's just like, that's a very, very glaring editorial oversight. And you're just like, and as we've learned about the process of how this book came together, it's like, it continues to show, it's like, this is very disconnected. Like people just wrote what they felt like, but there was no clear vision. And it just reflects that even more so. Like, and like some of these paragraphs contradict themselves, and you're just going, well, which is it?
The one coherent, like consistent vision I'm seeing, though, I have put this in the PDF, where I'm just like, oh, this is the type of samurai we're dealing with. Because there are like two major tropes of samurai: the like philosophical sage character who's stoic and honorable, and the second one we have is the very brutal, almost mindless warrior who's very concerned about personal appearances, that just goes around killing people. What we have here is the latter. And there's been a few mentions of Kozakura and Wa earlier, and I was like, uh-oh. But this is the first time we talked a bit more about it. I'm like, oh no. This is what we're going for. And
and this touches on the point, like one of the discussion points, which, well, actually two, right? Which is that Asians are seen as violent and savage, and then that Asians are seen as uncivilized and in need of saving.
In this case, the key is that they're saying one Asian group is like that, and the other is the opposite and more sophisticated.
And more like us.
More like Western. Yeah.
It's like it's creating an other and then another other.
Another other. Yeah.
Another other.
And like all of the language.
Other.
And all the language around Kozakura and Wa is very strong as well. So the first sentence from the section on merchants is, merchants in Shou Lung are not the despised class that they are in Kozakura and Wa. Here there are no haughty samurai to scoff at those who make their living from selling the work of others. And it comes up later too, the whole warrior class. They're not all walking around hand on sword, squinting at each other, being like, are you disrespecting
Psychic
me?
Duel time.
Yeah. And so
it's a bunch of crabs.
Like, historically, yes, merchants were the bottom of the Confucian, like, sort of socio-philosophical class system. But that doesn't translate into a consistent treatment within a society. It's part of larger structures, and some people might be dicks and be like, ew, merchants, but like for the most part, that doesn't mean everyone's going to like treat these people poorly, because they're also a necessity within society, but also despised. Like, that's going a bit far.
Yeah, and I just don't like that they put it as a contrast to this like Chinese equivalent, because the Chinese equivalent is the same. So if you're going to say that one doesn't treat it well, then you should say that both don't, because that's historically more accurate.
Yeah.
And it just
I think the
we're
point
getting
where
this
I think
this picture of like the easily offended and the quick to act and super rash, and like I don't have to tell other Japanese people that this is something that gets applied to Japanese people in real life. It's not as prominent as it used to be in the 80s, and it does get applied more to like masculine individuals. The idea of a Japanese businessman that will like behave like this trope of a samurai, that if you offend them, like not only is your business done, but they might physically harm you as well. That like that's just something that people have to deal with. This isn't just a fantasy or like literary trope. Like, it comes out and it bothers me.
Yeah, that's another one that I saw.
Part of the Yellow Peril, wasn't it? Kind of that whole fun thing.
I saw this as well with in the merchant section, because we might as well move on. There were two things that kind of hit me. First one was like they blatantly say all shopkeepers can do acupuncture.
I first of all, if I actually really need acupressure, I don't want to trust any generic shopkeeper, please.
Like, but they say that
any shopkeeper in Shou can clearly do this.
Like, I didn't really read it that way.
But they're trying to basically
like,
say like shopkeepers and
shopkeeper,
merchants are like another level.
Or that they do different things. That's like, people run different types of shops. Like,
I kind of got the I got the impression what they were trying to do with the merchants and just, doing it poorly. But like, which from a if I'm understanding the intent right, I don't necessarily have an issue, where the merchant case is really just the trade case. So it includes doctors, craftspeople, merchants, buyers and sellers of goods. And that's kind of what I thought they were going for, and they just stated it poorly.
It's really poorly stated, because they do say in this section, because after this they say, oh yeah, he is an innkeeper who gives a weary traveler a place to rest and find food. He's an herbalist who with his staff of apprentices grinds powders, blah, blah, blah. But they literally start by saying he is a merchant. He is a physician. It just read really strange.
But that's the thing. It's like, he's not a merchant. He's an innkeeper.
He's an innkeeper.
He's not a merchant.
He's a mother. He's a sinner. He's a saint.
Right?
It's like really, if they had just changed the word merchants to tradesperson, that probably would have eased up a lot of the confusion. For one.
So here's a part.
Kind of the everyone else category.
Everyone else, yeah. So then at the end of this section, at the start of page 16, they talk about the civil service examinations, which were very much a historical thing, and it's still very deeply rooted in contemporary China with the Gaokao exam, which is fucking scary. Like,
terrifying.
It's terrifying.
It is absolutely
I put in my own notes, which I'll import for you. It's like, I see why they have the Kumon City now.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yes.
When I read that civil service exam, I still have that memory, Emma, of remember when you and I went to the Forbidden City and we saw the parents like
waiting, and there are like banners everywhere, and all these parents are sitting on little portable stools
with cameras
waiting out front of this gated school. I'm like, what is happening?
And it's waiting for their kids to come out of the Gaokao practice, is what we were told. And gates open and the kids come out and they just look bummed. Like it was like, oh. But I don't see that as like necessarily a problem to include here, the civil service exam, because it was very much part of, Chinese history, contemporary culture, but also Chinese belief with mythological figures like Zhang Kui, like the Exorcist. Like his whole story is about the civil service examinations and how he, even though he was very successful, did not become a bureaucrat because he didn't look good.
Because he was too ugly.
He's too
That
ugly.
was-
You're too ugly. Yep.
And so
Mhm.
he,
I love how Junko's drawn, by the way, with the two little things.
well, the two little things, yeah. And they like, but they like, so like, I keep that in here because I think it's an interesting thing to include. And if you are going to make a setting about imperial China and you're going to lean into the bureaucracy, the civil service exam is something that you should include. So I look at this as something like, I'm glad they included that because it is a great way for them to frame how people can move in society. It's a narrative tool, and I think that's great. Now, there are things,
Also gets
there are
source
things
of,
around it that are bad,
tension.
but I think it's important that we highlight things that are good. And if you are going to include elements of traditional Chinese history and contemporary Chinese culture, because we talk about things that are like, yeah, this is in the present, and don't include that because it's in the present as well. The civil service exam or the contemporary Gaokao is something that you can include because it is deeply rooted in Chinese like folk religion as well, and how China as as an empire basically existed. Now,
Well, I just wanted to
Go ahead.
clarify that Gaokao is not equivalent to.
it's not the equivalent. It's just a
civils.
big test. It's a big test.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
More like I would compare it.
SATs.
I guess in function to SATs. though.
Except that it's all like a whole
not in
other
experience.
level.
Yeah.
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 Like it's like, yeah, the SATs are nothing compared to the Gaokao.
Yeah.
No,
it's true.
they're absolutely not.
But then they go. There's an interesting thing here. They talk about the merchant class, and I don't know if it was just like the frame of mind that I had when I was looking at that this morning. But they say it is only the merchant class that the happy coincidence of upward mobility and leisure time come together. It is rare indeed that a merchant's family does not have one son studying for his exams, supported by his entire clan, for if he is successful, the entire family will prosper with him. They say that, and before that they say, well, farmers can't do the civil service exam because they have way too much time tending the fields and taking care of beasts. But I believe we talked about this before, and the amount of time, you might have to actually study. And we see this in contemporary China too. We see people who come from like sort of like a lower class agricultural background and succeed at things like this because the Gaokao is very much an equalizer in a sense if you have access to study materials and time.
They do realize crops don't grow all year round.
Yeah,
right?
crops don't just grow. They're just
They
like,
don't go all
you're
year
watching
round.
it just like,
and also when you're
Winter
and also
does
when you're
exist.
Yeah.
winter. Well, first of all, winter exists. Most farming days end by sundown, which is usually like relatively early during some parts of the year. So what are you doing the rest
And there
of the
isn't a
time?
whole lot to do between planting and
exactly.
harvest sometimes.
If anything,
so,
they
Yeah,
would
like-
have more time.
Yeah. Well, I guess they're just like, oh, they must be like physically exhausted because
It bewilders.
tending those sheep.
It bewilders me because you figure for most of these writers, especially for a lot of the people for TSR originating in the Midwest, where there's a lot of farming country, you would think they would at least have
know better.
they would at least have some vague inclination.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm sure they knew, but they want to make it different.
Yeah.
Now, I think
Yeah,
if
okay.
I were to make a minor amendment to this, they put so much effort into saying that the peasant class of Wa and Kozakura have no freedom. And they say, oh yeah, the peasants of Shou Lung are, they have freedom.
but
they
no
could've-
time.
But no time apparently. But what they
No
could have
time.
done was they could have said the civil service exam is a way in which the peasant class can rise.
Yes.
Right.
And
I think-
that's a huge misstep here.
Yes. The thing is, like, when with all the previous descriptions in the way of work, where it's like talking about all these other classes, and it's like, yeah, like it's such a good life. It don't matter what you do. Like everyone's equal. You're a farmer, you're a merchant, you're an official, like I'm free. Like, and so then it's like, why in this section with the merchants would people want to take the exam and quote unquote advance through the social ranks when it seems like in the descriptions before there is no real difference in the social ranks, right? So it's just like, again, it's the kind of like you put one thing and then you put another thing that are aspects of the society, and then they don't make sense when you actually think about it. It's like,
Yeah. And then they threw in that one sentence that stood out to me, which is non-humans aren't allowed. I was
Yeah,
like,
that-
what do you
but that's
mean
the-
by
Thank you for bringing that up.
non-humans?
Yeah.
that's the-
also
but that's the
non-natives of the empire are not allowed too. I added that to my racism counter. Those two.
No, they
Well, that's-
can't.
that's-
Love
the-
racism.
The foreigners can. That's the next section. So on officials, they
Yeah, this is.
go
Sorry,
ahead,
go ahead.
Agatha. No, go ahead.
Oh yeah, it says foreigners and those favored by the court may also be appointed to official posts, though this is far rare. That's true.
And then
It
the
is
next sentence.
rarer. Oh, and then only non-humans are accepted from holding public office.
And it's like, what kind of non-human are we talking about here?
You wrote
Exactly.
Henge Yokai.
The Henge Yokai, which
Yeah.
is like half of what the emperor is right now. So like, is that
Yes,
what you
the
mean by
samurai
non-human?
emperor. Yes.
Or are you talking
Samurai,
like,
the samurai Bushi emperor.
yeah, or are you talking like
Who-
Burakumen, like the socially class-based non-human?
Yeah. I'm sure that's what they mean here. And I suspect that I'm of two minds on this. One, I completely agree with you, Emma. I would also add that in writing this, they're probably like, oh, you probably won't see an elf in public office. Or you probably won't see an orc in public office if
Why
you
not?
have players who are like, I want to get my character from Faerun over into Shou Lung. That's what I feel like. This is part compatibility note and part like racism.
Yeah.
It's very rare.
Yeah.
I feel like-
and there's no
I feel like it-
explanation.
Yes.
Yeah. Like there's no, like, it just feels so arbitrarily just thrown in. It's like, okay, but why?
And it's
Yeah.
jarring because all of the text before has been saying like how accepting and egalitarian
Mhm.
this society is supposed to be in this
Yeah.
specific section.
It's a,
Mhm.
I mean, especially since it's a cosmopolitan, it's like, okay, then what's with this?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. Like it has got that nationalist aspect to it, and then like we actually get into it, and it's like it turns into I don't know something. One thing that I really wish if we were to redo this section is just like let's just accept the fact that there's social stratification, and then like at the very end, I would actually put the exam. I would put the very big exam and say like, this is the way for social, like this is the primary best way for social mobility. Like,
Yeah.
and then just
Mhm.
go like take from like the previous chapter where we talked about like the various different social classes and like how they might prepare for the exam, what the stakes are, because honestly I think that whole exam deserves its own section where it really hammers home the impact of succeeding in these areas.
It's what they have the way of work, and then they later have the path of enlightenment and the way. Honestly,
Mhm.
the exam is literally like the way of
Should be its own
social
section.
mobility. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
The only thing I would fear is that somebody would write it and be like, okay, well, in order to do this, you must have an intelligence score of this,
Yeah.
and you must have
Yeah.
these skills.
Roll
'Cause
for fact retention.
and we've and we've seen that before, right? We've seen that in
Roll
Oriental
for
Adventures.
fact.
It-
Not
Yeah.
fact
It's still a
retention,
thing.
but
Still a thing.
we've seen that
I
before.
mean, yeah.
And then
Yeah,
I would also say
yeah.
like, oh, you also have to. Again, if we were just to add to this, or if somebody were to add to this, I would caution against writing an entire like long section and have maybe a paragraph or two basically being like, this is the exam. It is like purely in a sense an understanding of social customs, right? Because you have to understand how to navigate the bureaucracy, because they're looking for people of certain values. And then, an academic sort of test, because that's very much what it is. Because my fear is that people would be like, okay, you must do this, and then you must go duel this kung fu master, and then
No,
you
no.
must do this.
No, no, no.
Like
No,
that's
no.
that is my
No, no,
fear,
no, no.
because that is what
Yeah.
we've seen so far.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right?
Yeah.
that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but
Cross-legged
this is-
under a waterfall.
Under a waterfall, and if you could make it 30 minutes, or I guess they would say if you could make it for 30 moons, then you'd be good.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, I would
30
definitely.
moons, that's
Yeah,
a
I mean,
long
like,
time.
I'm coming at
That's
this
a
from
long
like,
time.
if I was writing this, I'd totally be like, just it's a focus on like, can you do the job well? Here are the actual skills necessary, and then like go into like how people can make a living, or like actually even talk about the Kumon system, like the
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
equivalent
you-
of like
It could just be like role playing tropes, or I wouldn't say tropes, role playing prompts. Like, hey, you have to
Yeah.
learn these things about show society. So if you were like a foreign character, you're like, oh, a part of my literal story could be I want to go and study for this. So on our adventures, say I'm a bard or whatever, if this was 5th edition, on our adventures, we're going around and I'm going to start asking people like, hey, what's it like doing this? Or can you tell me more about this? And that is narratively interesting because I'm studying, because my background is like, maybe I picked the peasant background or merchant background, and I now want to be an official. And so as your group goes on adventures, one character has this little sort of meta subplot where they're trying to learn more. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it could be like maybe part of. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was like, maybe some part of it could be like presenting like a paper or like some kind of presentation about like, this is what I've learned about this really cool practice or this like particular history of this family, or just like doing something like that. That's like much more.
Oh my
Yeah.
god!
You know what?
I was gonna say I would just
presentation,
take it literally and give them a straight up exam. It's like, welcome to game night. Here's your paper. Don't turn it over until I start.
Yeah,
I just went to my
Really wants to roll for retention.
in partnership with Kumon, Wizards of the Coast produced this PDF that you could download from
A study
Oh
guide.
my god,
Yeah.
study guide.
God.
Scantron.
We're the Scantron. Oh god.
my
Make
gosh,
sure
remember?
you don't use. Oh, and if you have to do a Scantron, you have to go on a whole quest to find graphite because you don't want to use ink. On
And
a
you have to
Scantron.
refine it a certain way to get number 2. So it's like
Yeah.
number 2.
Yeah,
You have to
yeah,
go
yeah.
find a smith.
I think all of us are kind of getting like,
Yeah.
Can I mention something? Just something I found
Yeah.
kind of interesting going through this section. So there's a strong implication that every single like peasant, merchant, whatever, everyone is a extended family with a lot of institutional wealth and history, and that's just how it is in the empire. And going to the adventure topic, I think that would have been a very interesting angle to portray a lot of adventuring types as those who kind of don't have that family for whatever reason. They don't have that support network. So it gives them reasons to exist as these sort of independent entities who are trying to make their own way in the world. So I feel that that's a real missed opportunity in this kind of conceptual, everyone is this big extended family with this big social network. All the peasants own their own land. They have this ancient, tradition of their family having always been there and having always worked it. So having something there for that contrast of the people whose families might have, all died out in a plague or whatever, that happens.
Okay, so
and what do these people do?
here's a proposal for a cool NPC.
Mm-hmm.
We have an NPC in Shou who was once like a peasant, didn't have a family, had nothing, and they were taken in by a noble who provided them with some resources so they could succeed in the civil service. And then they worked their way up, and now they have this big, huge like piece of land, and they provide folks who are just like them with resources to go into the civil service exam and succeed. That would be a really cool NPC to have, because
It's
now
also
you
historically accurate.
also historically accurate,
Yeah.
but also from narratively, if you want to do the whole fantasy thing, now you have a character who has all these connections and everybody knows about them and they're super helpful. And I think that would be really cool. You can take it a step
That'd be
further and be like,
super
oh,
cool.
make this like an orthodox sect of like the Wulin, and then they just help
Hey, look at you, talking about Confucius. So speaking of like large networks that are not necessarily families, I really am interested in talking about like the different paths and like the priests and monks and stuff. Like
I just read it and was
Yeah.
like, these are Jedi.
No, one is Buddhism and the other is Taoism. That's like,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
literally what it is.
but also like George Lucas was like, oh yeah, I'll call them Jedi.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You're not
no, these are
wrong,
just
but yeah.
the dark. I mean, it's just like the dark way, the light way. I'm like,
Yeah.
excuse me.
yeah,
I saw that. I was like, the dark way. Wow.
Like
I'm like,
the
these are
dark
they're like
Taoism.
Sith monks. Like, what the?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
also like at one point they're like, we have these priests and these monks that are kind of magical. Actually, they're just Wujen. That's like, then why don't we just call them?
Well, first of all, they're more wizards than clerics, and then they were like, no, they're actually Wujen. What?
So I'd actually like to talk about this. So for those who are listening or watching, because we don't actually, I decided that we wouldn't show the PDF on screen anymore, mostly because it's really hard to read and follow, and it doesn't make sense.
It makes our faces smaller.
It makes our faces smaller, exactly. So on page 16, it says the path of enlightenment, which espouses a written code of beliefs and actions. So that means there's got to be a book. Handed down from heaven by the celestial emperor, and the way, a religion of nature and metaphysics, which denies that true faith can be taught in books.
Yeah, man.
Okay, well, talk about like books and scripture and things like that. So they have those two things, and they basically portray the path of enlightenment as like Buddhism and the way as Taoism. Both are very twisted beyond what they actually are. They then say the path, so these are the Buddhists, study teachings and martial arts and healing arts. So if you are a Buddhist, a priest in Shou Lung, you are also a monk of the D&D variety. So they frame it kind of like that. When they talk about the way, Taoism, they say, and then this is where they like have multiple ways of spelling, they say Chung Tao priests are considered to be more wizards than clerics, for the deeper mysteries of their faith give them sorcerous control over the forces of the material world. These men are actually Wu Zhen, like Emma said. And then they go and say, although in theory the way is a truly neutral faith. So first of all, this is a D&D thing of putting alignment with religion.
Right.
In reality, there are two alignments of Cheng Tao. Same thing, spelling difference. Apostrophe because fantasy. No, actually, they do apostrophe because in early English romanization of Chinese, it had a lot of this. Those of the dark way using their powers for personal gain, and those of the light way using their powers for the good of others. There's dark.
It's
Taoist
Sith and
priest.
Jedi.
It's Sith and Jedi. It's straight up Sith and Jedi.
Sith and Jedi.
I think we should
It's just straight up Sith and
They're
Jedi.
actually Wu Zhen, but they're actually Jedi.
I'm just gonna put this.
Actually, they Jedi though.
I just appreciate Agatha throwing the horns and then the prayer hands.
Yes.
Yeah. So
A+.
here's a thing that I think is worth talking about, and it kind of ties into something else that I put here. So in this section, this is a very clear example of how D&D's European roots makes it very difficult to create a compatible culture. Because when they go into this and they're like, what are these? Who are these sort of religious practitioners? We have to frame them in a way that is compatible with, in this case, a D&D. So there is no real like Chung Tao priest class. So in order to have our players understand what they are and what they can do if you were a DM, right? They're wizards. They're not clerics. They're wizards. In a way, I'm kind of like, oh, I appreciate that you didn't make them clerics because the clergy is a whole other religious implication.
Yeah.
Cool. And then they say, no, they're wizards because they have like, their faith is all like mysterious and they have magic. This is where I think they really falter in that, you know, they immediately go and say, oh, this very European thing, the wizard, right? The sort of the Gandalf, the Merlin kind of character is also this Taoist priest. They do a good thing, though. At the very bottom of page 16, just above that table, they literally have a place to say classes in Shou Lung are similar to those commonly used in other parts of Kara-Tur. However, certain classes are named differently, and others are not native to the empire. So here's what I think is good. I think it's really good to have culturally relative terms to professions, things that you do. Now, the things that they picked aren't good. But I think the fact that they noted that these things are different is a really cool thing to do. Right? Because if for the sake of compatibility, you want to say, hey, call these things different things. Don't call them clerics, or don't call them, if you're, in Oriental Adventures, a literal class is Bushi, call them Tenshi or warrior here. Like, I think that's at least a good conversation to have. Now, they immediately say this after saying, "Oh yeah, these Taoist priests are wizards." Like that in and of itself is strange, because on the next page after the art, they literally say, "Oh, this fantasy Confucius wears a cone hat."
Yeah, like out of nowhere too. They're just like, "Oh yeah,"
and he wears a cone hat.
Confucius.
So
moving on.
there is a good thing in this mess, and that good thing is, if you're going to write a fantasy setting compatible with 5th edition D&D that is based on a culture that is not represented in D&D, you want to provide your players and GMs with a way of framing their D&D characters created using D&D's European roots in this world. Now, this does not succeed necessarily in Shou, but the thought of at least trying it, I think, is important to talk about and acknowledge.
So one thing that, one note, Jackie, that you put in at the beginning of that section, where it's like the whole thing about confusing religion and philosophy. And this, I think that is a very good point. But now that, Daniel, you're talking about like trying to, have additional cultures within the D&D setting, I wonder, like, I think if they just had, in terms of like including things like Taoism, which is more philosophy, but also you can say has like developed into, I guess, a kind of, it's not religion though.
It depends on your definition. We could say it also depends on your definition of religion, right? It does. Like, and I think in D&D, it's like, oh, religion
is
like
the belief system.
It's a belief system.
Yeah. Right. So I think if they just had that little bit in there where it's like, it's just like an addendum or like a disclaimer being like, people here don't think that it's a religion, but like it's the equivalent, then it's like, okay, yeah, that's fair. And I feel like it to have like culturally different settings, you just need to keep having these kind of disclaimers where it's like, it's not exactly the same, but like if you want to play it in this with D&D, then view it this way. But I don't know if that takes a lot of like the immersion out for people reading it. I don't know.
But here's the thing, they constantly break immersion here because they change the tone of how things are actually said here constantly.
There was some thought that immersion should exist, but the editorial department certainly did not get the memo.
The lack of one.
Lack of editorial.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. What editorial department?
Better.
There was an editorial department.
Yeah, and
welcome to the editorial department. Points at empty corner.
Yeah, this. I think it's. I think it's like an interesting thing to like bring up here. Now, Jackie, you also put a note, and I'm not too familiar with this. At the end of, just before the warriors section, you put a comment about when it said, for as it is written, if one cannot aspire to be an official of earth, it is just as well to become an official of heaven. Basically, those who retire become
flunk the exam.
Monks. You flunk the exam, you just become a monk. What did you mean about how this goes against Forgotten Realms cosmology?
Well, because for AD&D during that time period, it was the Great Wheel cosmology, right? And the Great Wheel cosmology has multiple planes of existence, including Mount Celestia, which is the Christian biblical like heaven. But there's also variations of that because there's Aboria and Elysium, which were like very inspired by other things. So when I looked at that and I saw that phrasing, I'm just going, you're literally, they took something that's more conceptually from like a Chinese, like an Asian idiom, and you try to transpose it. It's that compatibility issue again, because they're trying to impose something that's actually probably something that was a saying or an idiom into the Western framework, but then neglecting to realize that they're writing still for a fantasy setting, and there is no heaven technically in Forgotten Realms.
Right, I see what you mean.
Yeah, so that was my point, was like they broke their own immersion by putting something too realistic into it.
Speaking of too real, should we move on to Feng Shui?
Are we
Do
gonna
you
skip-
want
are
to
we
talk
gonna skip
about the
warriors?
warrior?
Are we
I
gonna
think
skip
we've only
warriors?
got like 30 minutes. I did
I
want to
already
say
talked
one,
about
one thing that
Okay,
bugged me
let's
about
skip
the
it.
Warriors is they all know Kung Fu.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
They
my
all
big
know
thing.
kung fu. And then there's always everyone has butterfly swords. I don't know why.
My
Everyone has
big
butterfly swords, and also they're not as like I'm gonna kill you.
They're
now.
not samurai.
That's-
They're not
Yeah.
samurai.
Oh,
my
they're not
only
samurai.
thing,
They're civilized.
my only thing with the warrior section, it's less the kung fu thing and more of like how they say like kung fu and nunchucks are like this separate thing,
Nunchaku.
and then
Yeah.
and then these spears, butterfly swords, axe and bow, they're separate. They're not martial arts, right? But in reality, martial arts is weapons.
All
Or
the
in
things.
general,
All
martial
weapons.
arts is
Martial
literally a mastery
war
of
stuff.
martial forms and the arts of combat.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So that's my big thing. It's like I hate how they just go and say, kung fu. Just say they are masters of unarmed combat and combat with a variety of weapons. Done.
Yep.
Leave it.
Yes,
Done.
They're warriors.
they're warriors. They
I-
fight.
The only thing I would have added here is the sort of, and then again, this is just a lot of from like the research I've been doing is the whole like gentleman scholar, the jian, and the different weapons and their status symbols or their implications, right? Because you see like different Chinese swords are used in different senses. The jian later on in Chinese history became more of a scholarly or official weapon, and then the Dao became more of like an actual wartime weapon, which I think is like an interesting thing to talk about. But anyways, yeah, let's move on. Do we want to talk about that piece of art, by the way?
I've titled the caption like New Yorker style. I put this down as where are my dumplings? That's the caption.
It's a good caption.
So
Where are my tiny dumplings?
for the audience,
It's just this dragon showing up.
it's a
I just-
dude fishing
yeah.
and then a dragon coming out of the water,
Looking
Mouth
And
pissed.
looking pissed.
Yeah.
Looking pissed. And this person
The Asian dude is like
the
get the
boat,
side eye. He's just like, oh.
It's just like he's not even scared. He's just like
Yeah.
He's just like,
What?
bro,
He's like,
bro,
this
you're
is-
disturbing the fish.
I
I
feel
just
like
feel
that-
like this is our narrator. And instead
Yeah.
of being like
Ah.
omnipotent, like he's saying he's omnipotent and glorious, but actually he's just the most annoying
Oh, you know what we should
character
do?
who goes
we,
around pestering the people of Show.
we should do
Yeah, and they're like,
we should do like
trolls.
a we should do like a
Dragon
caption
trolls
contest.
people.
We should do a caption contest.
yeah,
put
yeah. We
this-
should do a
Yeah.
caption contest.
We'll put this on our Discord and be like, caption this. For me, it's like, hey, can you tell me about the way of work? Like that's 100% what this is.
Can I? Okay. Have you? No. It's like, can I interest you in the way of work? can I interest you in the way of work?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're
Hey,
gonna
did
we're
you
gonna.
know that in WAP?
Did you know that
Did
in
you
what?
know that in what?
Oh my god.
Okay, so I'm gonna actually do this. We're gonna put this on our Discord, and then we'll go ham.
Yeah. New
Because now
Yorker
that we have the
style.
thread,
Get
now
at
that we
it.
have the thread feature, we can do that.
Go threads.
Threads. Okay, so next one is Confucius, the Lao Chin Mao, who wrote the Book of Heaven, and is a wizened, snappish old man who wore What does old-fashioned robes mean? First of all, please give me context. And a
Especially
conical
because he
hat.
apparently lived like 2,000 years before the modern time, if the timeline we saw was accurate.
I didn't even bother
So-
to look. I'm just.
Yeah.
I just.
Yeah, I think
is
he's
like-
like 2,000 years old.
Yeah. Don't put
I
it.
don't know.
Or, well, he's dead, but 2,000 years ago.
He's unless he became an undead mage.
Or
You
he's a
never
lich.
know.
He's
Or
a
he's a
lich
lich.
now.
A Confucian
He's
lich.
a lich now.
Do you
Which
think
is
Can you
that the
imagine being a Confucian
horrifying.
lich?
Where's the phylactery? Is the phylactery in the conical hat? That's just all. That's
No,
just,
the hat's the hat is a phylactery.
Yeah,
We've
the hat's a
decided.
phylactery.
Yeah, we've decided that's what it is.
Confucius.
Ugh.
Cthulhu. Oh.
It's
Confulich? Oh no.
I feel like there's somebody out here. Somebody probably like, oh wait, a phylactery hat. It could speak. It's the sorting hat.
Oh no. Oh no, it's even
Somebody's
worse.
gonna do that. So I bet you somebody's done that.
So wait,
That's
and then
great.
when
Also,
they take
fuck
the
J.K. Rowling, by the way. Fuck J.K. Rowling.
Yes.
Well, yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
Fuck
Fuck
J.K.
J.K.
Rowling.
Rowling. But
First of all,
but I will
talking
say-
hat is the only point of reference here. Fuck J.K. Rowling.
Yes.
Anyways, let's move on. 'Cause that's all that needs to be said about that author.
Let's
Well, that's
talk
all they
about
kinda
feng
give you.
shui.
Yeah, it's all they kind of give you. Let's talk about feng shui because like
Yeah.
which is
for-
a real thing.
Go off, Jackie.
Go
We
off,
got-
Jackie.
Now it's your turn.
because I don't know anything about this.
So So, okay, so just for a point of background reference, so from the years of 2004 through 2009, I actually spent extensive amounts of time actually practicing Taoism and that was just purely because I was just interested, and I did a lot of it as self-taught, and then eventually I found out later, like a couple of years ago, there was like a Taoist priest on YouTube, and he actually does a lot of great advice and talks about stuff. I think he's based in the US somewhere, I forget where. But yeah, he actually wrote like a long segment about even talking about the I Ching, the Book of Changes. And so I like him. He's really funny. He actually reminds me of one of my uncles. Anyways, but the point is, so they start with, so this section that they're getting into, they go into feng shui, but in a different section further down, they go into they talk about the trigrams, which they are technically two different things, but they're not two different things. Also, I don't understand how the trigrams fit into social customs.
And it comes after like clothing, or is it? Yeah.
It's after the flower girls. It comes after flower girls.
It comes after flower girls.
What is the logic?
The flower girl conversation is a separate thing.
What was going on with these like chopsticks things? Like,
okay. So
dear Americans,
I was
chopsticks
confused.
are eating implements.
Yeah,
They're not magic.
So just to situate our listener or watcher in where we are right now, what section of the book do we want to kind of start with, Jackie?
Okay, so
we're
you
talking
want
about
to
these
start
chopsticks.
Right. So let's start with feng shui itself, and that's on page 18. So they start with feng shui calling literally feng shui wind and water. I'm like, okay, thank you. Is the ancient Shou art of place divination. A master of feng shui is able to divine the proper place in which to perform certain activities, such as casting spells, creating magical devices, locating safe places for camps and fortifications, which basically is a really long, drawn-out way of calling it geomancy, and in a very loose term. And basically, feng shui is not just a divination tool; it is actually supposed. So if I believe we already did, you already did an episode about qi, right? Yeah. So feng shui has a lot to do with originally the original form of feng shui dealt a lot with qi, because it was all about qi from both internally and externally, and understanding how the flow of qi goes through objects, places, and things, and then trying to and basically it's all about maximizing it and making it optimal for you, the user. So that is what feng shui is intended for. That was the intention of the structure of what it was made for. And it has a lot less to do with divining anything, more so to just maximizing and optimizing yourself in reality, on the earthly plane.
Yes. I that's go ahead, Jackie. Sorry. I'm just
No, you're fine.
Yes, preach. Yes.
Now,
as someone who has also studied feng shui, I'm like, yes.
And then the next section, they start talking about the things that most people associate with feng shui, or what the Western view of feng shui is whenever they hear the word, which is about furniture arrangement and placements of doors and windows, and how to avoid evil buildings for some reason.
That building,
totally evil.
So here's the thing. I think that when we did our chi and ki episode, it's like the feng shui section starts as basically a way of framing something that's very complicated around gameplay utility.
Yep.
Right. It's about gameplay utility, and then they go into like, oh, here's the flavor. Right.
Yep.
And I think that's like you shouldn't do that. Like, this is like a big no.
Feng shui by itself is much more complicated. There are four major schools of feng shui, two of which are which are the most commonly used versions, are considered counterfeits of the original version. So, and because they've been repurposed for different reasons, and plus feng shui incorporates Taoism, the 5 elements, and a bunch of other concepts throughout its development, because feng shui is actually technically more of a newer concept than compared to Taoism, and so and the the trigrams. So it's like it kind of morphed along with everything else.
Do you think then that it would have been a good fix or an amendment if they basically took the way and the path and aligned this fantasy feng shui with the two religions that they spoke about, given the connections?
Yeah, it would, because it has a lot to do with the practices, because Taoists still utilize some of the concepts of feng shui are in Taoist practices. It's just that feng shui adopted for specific needs as a toolkit, and Taoism is literally a structure and system for using, and like most other systems of conceptually magic or religion, is a form of understanding the world, basically looking at the world and saying, okay, what's going on with the world, and basically having a means to understand it. So that's what Taoism usually does, and feng shui is just another part of that, but it's specifically more of a toolkit.
But in this toolkit, it's a level 3 spell, is what they say.
Yes, which apparently all it does is just tell you that whether a place is basically it detects if a place is good and evil from a 5e mechanic standpoint, and then goes into saying that the second, because it's 2 parts. The feng shui spell is a 3rd level spell, by the way. It has 2 parts. The first part is basically saying detect good and evil in a space, and then the caster has to make a saving throw, and then if they succeed, they gain valuable intuition about it. So it's kind of like an augury kind of effect. So it's like, I'm just like, okay, I guess.
Their example of how it works.
It's so funny.
Okay, let's read the example. The example is the most confusing thing ever. So the example reads, for example, a Shugenja casts a feng shui spell while standing in an old temple. He instantly detects the lingering aura of evil over the place. Pondering hard and making a successful saving throw, he decides that this evil could perhaps be counterattacked if the temple were thoroughly cleansed through a purification ceremony. Later, he casts the spell when setting up camp. Unknown to him, there is a kappa living in the district. Again, making the saving throw, he realizes this site has bad feng shui, and he would be better off putting the camp further away from the water.
For audio listeners, I've been shaking my head this entire time.
So here's like a thing that's really interesting, because I have a strong feeling that this was cut, and this might have been cut and paste or from OA. Right?
It might have been.
Because here's the thing here.
Yeah.
And like, I'm sure people are going to be like, this is in an Unearthed Arcana, or this is in Oriental Adventures. My point still stands, because they say Shukenja, and then literally the page before, on page 16, they say Shukenja is supposed to be a dang key in Shou Lung.
Yeah.
And then they also say a kappa, which is
which is a Japanese
Yeah. But also, like, I cast feng shui. It's like,
I cast feng shui.
I cast feng shui on this kappa.
Also, like, camp, you know what? Like, setting up tents. I'm like, you know what? Cast feng shui.
Cast feng shui.
Cast feng shui. Is this a good campsite? Cast feng shui.
Yeah. I can't.
Yeah, it was really. But then I love that there was also a list for certain things that promote good or bad feng shui. That was my personal favorite of offense, because that list is the weirdest arbitrary choice ever. So
it's also not.
It's also not true.
Windows.
It's not true.
Which, by the way, for those who want to know, audio listeners, so they mentioned good feng shui as like things like round windows, the color red, ornate front gates that will scare away evil, windows or doors that face north. First of all, you should never do that. But also, and then they mentioned things for bad feng shui, like triangular doors, windows, the color black, doors facing the street, and then windows or doors facing west. Now, the west part is they got roughly, there's a reason for that, but that one they got mostly right. But the triangular doors and windows are actually a facet of one of the 8 trigrams when you're doing feng shui. Because if you decide to Google or anything, there is the most modern conceptualization of feng shui deals with the compass board, and that is actually a particular school of feng shui, which is the most commonly seen version of feng shui, which is the Fuxi Bakua feng shui, and that is a specific school of them, and it deals with the compass. Because so the story behind that is that Fuxi basically saw a turtle while on a river, near a river or a pond, and was trying to determine was just basically sitting there and got inspired by the shellback of this turtle and basically decided to divide space into 9 particular quadrants. And so you basically broke space into 9 zones with the center in the middle, but all of energy flows are on the other 8 perimeters, and you are in the middle. And so that's where you got the kind of modern version of that compass board coming in. And then we'll get into the trigrams in a second. But that in of itself is like, there's reasons for positioning, and there's different of those different locations have different purposes, functions, and associations and affinities.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I will say they you generally don't want like the front door of a home to be facing west, because there's a reason for that. You can have a door if it's not like the front door. Okay, don't panic if you have a door or a window on the west facing west. You just generally don't like the idea of having a front door facing west.
I'm just looking at my house on Google Maps and being like, "Hey, is it facing west?"
Oh no!
Bad feng shui.
It's not okay, but there are ways to mitigate it. And here's the other thing too that I want listeners to also understand: feng shui is not static. By the way, the philosophies of feng shui and all the art, the aspects of feng shui, the things that promote feng shui, like good and bad feng shui, are not static. They fluctuate, and that's what real feng shui works. Now, that's why certain schools don't always fit certain models of feng shui, because some of them are more static. They are very arbitrary, and then there are other ones that actually are fluid and will fit temporally with time. Which is why, for those of any Asian listeners who go and deal with Chinese New Year every year, their families sit down in front of the television either the television or they have a red book telling them about their fortunes. And because a lot of it is going to be applied from feng shui, and they basically change year to year, because guess what? He's a living thing. It moves, it changes. You kind of have to follow with it and figure out where it's going. So that's why if anyone ever sees that and they wonder, why do you keep changing the house and the room? It's like, there is a functional reason for that.
Does this tie into the whole thing where my mom's like, oh, before Chinese New Year, you have to make sure you clean your house before, not after Chinese New Year, because you don't want to clean out all of your good wealth.
Oh, well,
is that feng shui,
that is,
or is it just like,
it's not belief? I wouldn't consider it feng shui. That's more belief. That is a cultural imprinted tradition that's been carried through from the original heritage of the Chinese New Year tradition. Okay. Cool. Because the reason is because if you try to clean, for anyone who's listening who's not Asian, if you clean during Chinese New Year or right after Chinese New Year, you're basically throwing away all your good luck that you just accumulated, and versus before. So if you do it the week before, you have all the baggage of the previous year, so you want to clean it out. So that's what the point is.
So,
but
for the sake of moving on. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Michelle.
The front door is facing north. Sorry.
That's not
the front door. The front door of my building faces north and is painted bright red.
Yeah.
Oh.
Nice.
Bright red.
Like, the way they frame the like bad features is that it's how you can identify an evil structure. As if it has certain...
Can you imagine
it has to have edges. It has to have edges.
So one of them is like doors facing street, bad feng shui. Can you imagine a character who's just like walking down the street in a city being like, everything is bad feng shui because all the doors face the street?
Yeah, like that part really just threw me off for the loop. It's like doors facing a street. Have you ever been in a city?
Yeah. But it's just so funny because it's not even about like good and bad feng shui, but by the time that they describe how to use it in game, it's about detecting evil versus good. So it's like if you see a building with triangular windows painted black, you know it's an evil layer.
It's just a triangle house with triangle windows and a triangle door and like that faces the street. It's painted black.
That
you're like,
says,
oh yeah, that house.
am evil.
I am evil.
I know. A bad Eastern paladin who gets feng shui. It's like class ability and just keeps going around scanning and then burning down buildings.
Oh well, that's 100% like it's not actually like it's not detect good. It's divine sense. It's 5th edition's divine sense for the paladin. It's like it's literally feng shui sense. That's what it is.
Yeah, that's pretty
Yeah,
much
feng
what
shui
it feels like.
And your
It's feng shui.
Asian paladin with feng shui sense walks into a city, and then the GM's like, you all of a sudden feel the sudden urge to just go ham on all of these buildings. I pull up my greatsword and I start chopping down doors.
You just start chopping out doors. You like chop down. You do a strength check to bust open a wall to like install the new door.
Or it's just like you've got like a paladin or whatever you want to call it, who's walking around with a compass checking each door. I can't go through this door. It's not. It's facing west. Can't go that way.
Can't go that way.
The people inside are evil.
Honestly, because I want us to move on to the clothing part, because I think that's a very valuable discussion. I think the feng shui section, based on what you've said, Jackie, is very much a reduction of something very complex and that is still practiced in the present.
Yep.
But it reduces it in a way where it is enforced as something purely mechanical. It's this ancient art, but it's a level 3 spell, and that's really it.
I mean, they did the same thing to the trigrams, and that's even more complicated.
So let's move on to, I think we could get it done.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Clothing.
Let's do it.
Clothing.
Fetishization.
Yeah.
So-
the fetishization chapter.
Let's do
Hello.
it.
Yeah, and we could go beyond. I'm okay. Normally we go for another 10 minutes. I'm okay just finishing the section if y'all are okay with that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it.
Well, we
Yeah.
did talk about Fast and Furious for like
Yeah.
half an hour before, so like we kind of ate into our usual time.
Okay, so
As we were
we're
trying to
gonna
delay
attack
having
this
to talk
fast.
about this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So let's do it.
Yeah.
Who wants
Let's attack this fast and furiously.
Yes,
Wow.
fastly and furiously.
So anybody want to start? Is there anything that we want to talk about here? I mean, there's a lot we want to talk about, but
I think
Oh,
the first thing that we really need to talk about is the is it Chanson? How do you pronounce the name of this dress?
Is it
it's the kipao that people know about.
Is it
Qipao.
Qipao or the Cheongsang?
Like
Yeah.
why is this the outfit that most women wear? Like,
It's
super uncomfortable.
It's very impractical.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about like the way that or that Qipao kind of like came to be during what is the time period, like the 50s?
It's like the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
20s and 30s.
Yeah.
So that was like there was like a period of time where there was a lot of Western thought that like went into China, and then there's also the time that's like right before. Well, it's kind of like the war with Japan and all that stuff. So it was like there was a lot of like political unrest, and there was also a lot of like a lot of intellectual fermentation, I guess, where it's like a lot of people are like, oh, like all these different things, like our old ways of thinking, like, is it even right? And so like there's a lot of like that kind of like westernization and exploring new modes of thought, and with that also to kind of represent that, people started taking on like more westernized clothing. And a part of it that was really interesting is that for men, that was like one of the first times where they had like a one piece outfit. I don't remember what it's called, but it's like that is a thing that like a lot of people, if you watch the dramas from that like that period of time, they always wear that, and they always have those circular glasses. And qipao at the time was a very like it's a thing that people wear, women wear, that is like very forward thinking, because it's the first time that a Chinese woman can also wear just one piece for their clothing, whereas before it was only men who could do that. And so that was like, it was like a symbol of like adopting a new way of thinking and a new way of life. And also like, and so when it was first adopted, like the different lengths of the hem, it was very long at first, and then, you know, depending on like what people wore them for and like why it then became like thin, slimmer and slimmer. And that was also because like of a fashion forward, like I'm a forward thinker kind of thing, where it's like, oh, these like traditional thoughts of like of like women need to be modest. Like I'm throwing that away, and so I'm going to wear like something that's form-fitting. And of course, like in there is a lot that has to do with the fact that there were a lot of like the singers or whatever they're called. Someone else had a better note for
in this
the,
thing
the right terminology. No, like historically they were, I don't know what they were called, but like there were a lot of like I guess they're kind of like
lounge singers.
I guess they're like lounge singers. They're like socialites. And so it was also like, you know, like a sex appeal thing and like all that stuff. But I feel like the way that it gets identified, that Qipao gets identified in the West, is very coded in this like this fetishization of like a Chinese woman, the Chinese female body, of like having that really high slit and then like it being like really sexy and like kind of mysterious with the red lips or whatever.
The slit reference is what I found particularly off-putting about this, where they're saying that every single one of these outfits that basically every woman in these major cities wear has a slit all the way up to their hip. Like that was just very... Why?
Yeah. It's playing into the whole like dragon lady trope.
It is. I mean, so so there was a very similar movement in the 50s and 60s in Vietnam with the Ao Dai becoming much more form-fitted, and there was this but I mean, I'm gonna say like we got pants though, like, and there's no mention of pants. It's just like this again, this is the sexualization, like the fetishization of the cheongsam, like of the cheos, I guess, whatever you want to call it here, but also this idea of just like the dress is embroidered with gold or silk thread, and it's I guess like but they also say like, oh, it's especially popular with sing-song girls and other female entertainers, but they never go into like, so they specify this is what the women wear, but only certain women wear this. So what do the women wear? And they go into like older women wear a less revealing version with enormous sleeves and a high collar. And I'm like, no one can work in that, excuse me. So it's really just, we're only going to focus on the sexy lady clothing. And like, oh yeah, old ladies also exist.
Yeah.
But like, what do like other women wear?
Yeah, the whole section opens with the people of Shou wear clothing much like other people of Kara-Tur. I'm like, thank you, that helps.
Except
that gives me such an excellent frame of reference.
I'm like, my imagination, it is a light. I am seeing this vivid landscape of its people.
Well, no. What it's really saying is think of all your Asian stereotypes and fetishizations and then shove it in here.
Yeah, it's very much like, certain people wear this, like scholars and officials, and then like this stuff, and then let's talk about the equivalent, the Chousung, which is basically the same thing.
Let's get the sexy thing first.
And
like that too.
Let's really go into detail about this, and then also, oh, by the way, who wears these? Oh, you know, like the whores, basically, because it's and like they it really annoys me that they're like they want to like really get that like raunchiness in there, but then they're also like, but we're not gonna say it like out loud, you know, like the sing-song girls, and it's like, you want to talk about the sluts that you can sleep with when you're playing a game, then fine, just say it. Like, I mean, it makes me really annoyed.
I mean, it again reinforces the fact that, you know, the considering that how much TSR was very much the boys club frat feel.
I think that like this very much is like a missed opportunity to talk about like clothing in Chinese history and how like not everyone wore the same thing, and they were
which
like,
it does
different,
say
like,
that
and there were like different like folk traditions when it came to what you were wearing. I say dress as in not a dress, but dress as in like the act of dressing yourself. I think it's really interesting. You mentioned earlier, Agatha, about the suits. Do you mean like the Sun Yat-sen uniforms?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So what's really interesting, so I mean, we could do a whole series on just clothing, which we do plan on doing. because clothing has there are a lot of political implications to talking about clothing and that. And we're going to have like experts on this. We've already planned this. But I think the thing here that we kind of have centered on is how women are portrayed in this, because this is really one of the first sections where we get a lot of detail.
Yeah. And also for the men, they're just like, men wear pajamas.
Men wear pajamas.
The women, though.
Yeah, it's like the weirdest description. It's just like...
Specifically.
Yeah. So...
Yeah,
it's like old ladies entertainers.
Yeah. But then also the comparison to Kozakura and Wa, where it's like their clothing is weak.
Yeah.
Like, their fabrics are weak and they wear many layers of flimsy material. It's like, it's the exact same material as they would have been using in China. But also
the fact that it's like many layers and also flimsy at the same time, like that just doesn't feel right at all.
It's also,
which is really weird because Chinese clothing at that time period was also very layered. It was a thing.
Well, layers were important though. They were culturally important.
Yeah.
And that's the thing too. Like when kimono were layered heavily was primarily the Heian period, and it was done by people of status, specifically by women, to show good taste and all of that, but also that they don't have to work. And Michelle, you brought up like the whole massive sleeves, like how do you do anything? A lot of women's clothing was restrictive or absurd because it was specifically to show that they didn't work, that they were a particular class, that you couldn't possibly do anything.
Or like the
Heian kimono,
long nails.
like you needed attendants to get you into them.
And mostly sat around like those screen prints that you see of that period with like
there's similar stuff for Western clothing too, right? Like I feel like some of the big dresses that women wore in
with
like the Baroque period,
with or Victorian, I think is the era. It's kind of the same idea of these just huge.
Well, they did it during the Baroque too.
Yeah,
they did during the Baroque.
Big dresses are just a general like
those French like saddle things.
The panniers, the ones that you have to enter sideways. Have to enter doors sideways.
Stuff that happens.
Crab walk, the first crab walk.
Yeah, seriously. But then taking that and saying that it's all people's clothing of a particular place and time doesn't make sense. So not all Kara-Tur and not all Wa and Kosakuran people would be walking around in many layers of kimono. Like, do you think a samurai is doing that? Like, how do they get angry with each other if they can't move properly and their clothes are flimsy?
It's like in a Christmas story. In a Christmas story.
Story, yes.
Right, you just lay there like a slug.
Man.
I want to make a last point about gender, specifically like this like sexualization of women in this text, where it's every single time like people of quote unquote Kara-Tur were mentioned, it's always coded very masculine, and it almost seems like whenever they were writing all this stuff, it was always about men, and then the specific section that is actually talking about women is that little bit with the clothing, and then this own individual section, sing song and flower girls.
Yes.
And it's like, so first of all, there's like two things wrong with that. First of all, when you're talking about other things like farmers and or shopkeepers, merchants, whatever, you've been assuming that they were all men, or you assume that your readers would read them as all men, which is, that's just like a part of the time, but also that it's still the case. And then here, right, let's talk about women. Sexy. Like, it's very much like, what is the purpose of women within this world? It is as for the purpose of sex, right?
And so eye candy and to be kidnapped.
Yes, and
or to wear really big sleeves.
Or when very revealing clothing, right? Like, it's very much like women have this very specific purpose, like to be pure and rescued, and or sexy, and to be slept with if they're like sing song and flower girls, or to be both. We can mix it up. We're so creative.
The women exist in service of the needs of the assumed male protagonists, party members.
Yeah, and you know this too. Yeah, well, also like if you notice though, you can tell right away for how much they put that emphasis in because of the change of heading. The header for Sing Song and Flower Girls is much larger than the small little dots they used for the different ways of work positions for like the merchants. It's just bolded with a little colon.
That's
it's
true.
just bolded. It's
Yeah.
like you can tell how much they put more emphasis there on a one paragraph section about Sing Song Girls and Flower Girls. It's like, what?
You can tell what their priorities were.
You can tell where the priority was.
The whole section is also very confusing in terms of like, again, like they cannot talk about like this Chinese equivalent without comparing it to a Japanese equivalent. It's almost like they don't know enough about ancient China, and they can only draw on the information that they think they know, and they think their reader knows about ancient Japan, to be like, okay, Asia, but not that Asia. And like it's like talking about like, okay, the Sing Song Girls are not highly trained, nor is she the member of a geisha house.
Which they were.
She's just
they were highly trained.
And it's like, oh, she's just a gold digger, and it's just like there's so much of the context that is
lost. And it's also it becomes not like it's something that they chose to do. They run away to do this, whereas much like geisha, were daughters sold into and trained heavily to become this, either because their family can support them or they were making money for their family. Like it was a trade.
This is like very much like I'm seeing was The Fabulous World of Susie Wong and like Miss Saigon. Like these are, I think these are direct references to these films, I think, and these like I don't get me started on Miss Saigon, but like it's very clear that like this is what they perceive a woman entertainer or a woman who dresses herself up like this is they explicitly like see them as sex workers essentially, and like that's it. This is what women can do, and that's pretty much it. It's like the joke about like historical reenactments and how women are always like put out because all they get to be is like a wench,
a lotus blossom,
a nurse.
It's
a lotus blossom. So this is I think just very clearly taking from that same fabric.
The entire clothing and Sing Song Girls section is a really not only is it super problematic, but it also stands out to me in a sense where like they have no idea how people dressed in historical China. Nope. And they simply went with like 19th century clothing for women because that's what they see in media. And then for men, they're like, oh, you know, they wear the like armor and these big robes and all that stuff. But they didn't do any research in traditional clothing because there's this huge, strange, like historical like disconnect between like the religions, the emperor, some of the other social customs like the jade and the big ass heavy necklace. But then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, they dress like 1920s Asian women in these lounges, like. It's wild. Now, if
like famous Sing Song Girls have become the concubines of emperors, but like the Sing Song Girls is very clearly like referring to the 1900s. Oh, and then I just have so many questions.
So if you were to obviously just like redo this entire section, just literally gut it, get rid of everything here, and do it again, do you think that it would be better to make this section illustrated with notes rather than just have it all be text?
Yeah.
With examples and with examples, because it's just more about contextually, like this is the common trends. These are not like reflective that everyone follows through with it.
Exactly. Like we could even break it down by region and just say like, you know, there are certain regions where maybe they grow like, I think we talked about this before in another section where they were like, here's the capital, and they are more fashion forward, and maybe there's like silk production in this area, or maybe this area wears more cotton because that's what they happen to produce. This is areas colder, so they wear more furs. Like this, just it would make sense to break it down that way.
I feel like that really, like, whenever they did cover those sections for the different provinces, they should have just included the clothing there, because it makes more sense, because clothing is very regionally specific.
Yeah.
As well, so it just makes sense.
So here's an interesting thing that I want to propose as we kind of close up this episode. There was a suggestion that we got on Twitter, a really good one.
Ooh.
We talk a lot about what we would do to fix this. I am proposing that, and we could even publish this through Valorous Games or something, Leanna.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to do that.
I propose that next month's episode, we actually don't read, and we spend the 2 hours creating a city of our own, or town of our own. So what I think we should do is we should sit down and say, like, okay, what are we going to... What is this? I want us to act on what we've said. So, like, how do they dress here? What is the... And we can discuss this, like, off camera, but like if we're doing show, we'll be like, okay, let's make a show town, right? So this will be Chinese. What time period are we going to adhere to? What are the social customs? How do people dress? What are some key NPCs, right? And with the goal of, by the end, maybe having like a one pager of like, here's a town that you could put in your setting. What do you folks think of that?
I think that's great.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a great idea.
And I think we should just, if you're okay with this, Leanna, we publish this through Valorous Games.
Yeah, I would be happy to do that.
Keep it in an Asian
Liana
business.
Liana can help with roads.
Yeah.
We have all the proper roads.
Okay, that what we create is logistically sound, or heads will roll.
I'm for it.
One of the two.
Yes.
No, so we'll have rules: no circles, no concentric rings, nothing like that. No, I strongly think we should next month take a break from reading this piece of crap book and make our own shit live.
I have like this whole week after reading this. I don't know if it's ever came up, and if it hasn't, I'm surprised. But the term Kara-Tur has been in my head. It was like it was sitting right there. You just have to.
You've never done that, yeah.
I've never done it. Wow.
So we've got one last thing is trigrams. But one thing that I want to bring up, if you folks out there who are watching, listening, or like the five of you, if you've never read this book, it's a really interesting one, and it's by Hua Mei, and it's a book literally called Chinese Clothing. And it is a breakdown of Chinese, like Han clothing, but also different, all the different cultural and ethnic groups in China. Their clothing, basically from, I think the earliest in this book, it goes from the Zhou dynasty all the way, and like late Zhou, all the way into the present in the early 2000s. And it's an evolution of Chinese fashion, not just the clothing, but also how people wore their eyebrows, how they painted their lips, how they did their hair, their shoes, their underwear, and how Chinese underwear evolved over time. Very fascinating book. It's like $20 at a bookstore.
That's worth it.
Chinese Clothing by Hua Mei. Fantastic reference. It's got like historical illustrations, and it's got like photos from like museums, as well as like photos of like different ethnic groups as well. Really interesting book. Last thing we have is this trigram thing.
Yep. Why is it shoved in right after clothing? I have no idea.
That was going to be my question.
And my
I
comment
just got
was
very mad about the chopsticks. Like,
okay,
someone please explain to Westerners that chopsticks are eating instruments. They're not.
Can you imagine?
They're not magical things.
Like someone just took a bunch of forks and just like broke them and threw them on the ground.
Spell components.
Like, oh yeah, divination.
Now you say that, then somebody will do that.
Because I think that conveys the ridiculousness a bit more. Like,
yeah. Which it also could telegraph to me that whoever wrote that section had no idea what was involved with the process. So the trigrams, for those who don't know, involves basically it's basically, so trigrams are basically 3 lines that are either broken or unbroken. Now the thing is though, I don't know why they call it trigrams when they're trying to refer to the I Ching or the Book of Changes when it deals with hexagrams, not trigrams.
Yeah.
Clearly, again, the person who wrote this did not do enough research. But generally speaking, for trigrams, they represent, there's 8 combinations because you have 3 lines. They can be broken or unbroken. So there's 8 combinations. That's why you get the bakwa, which means the 8 symbols. That's how you get it. Now the trigrams, because they deal with another set of 3 lines that can be broken or unbroken, means you have 8 times 8, which is 64 patterns. And those patterns are actually they're more like a reference tool, as some Taoist priests will tell you. It is the Book of Changes is just a giant reference book. It is literally, okay, here's my result. Let me refer to this giant tome with multiple pages for what it could possibly mean based on the intent. Because if for anyone who practices any kind of divination will tell you, when you try to do these sort of things, you have to have a clear and understanding of what your intentions are. What is your question? That is what clairvoyancy is. Clairvoyancy is a term that refers to divining something using a randomizer, such as for the case of trigrams, how they use the 2 most common ways to do it is either through 50 yarrow sticks, which is weird, and then the coin flips. Coin flips are the most commonly seen ones that you'll ever see. It's always 3 coin flips, and they have a code. There's a mathematical coding that you do to determine what your results are, to determine whether it's a broken or unbroken line. It's a literal mathematical formula. It doesn't take too long to do. You can literally Google that.
So do you think, Jackie, is like, this is all new to me.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this would be something that you would want to see in a game where they're like, literally have a coin, flip it this many times, look at this table?
I actually thought about making something using that for a long time. I have.
That's cool.
Yeah, but the problem is like, it's so closely rooted to I Ching that I just was afraid that it would just diminish for what it is. Don't get me wrong. There is a tabletop game that's literally uses a phrase from Han Solo that's never tell me the odds, and it's literally just coin flips. Like the randomizer is through coin flips. So I have seen something like that, and it can be done.
It seems like the big question is whether or not mechanizing these kinds of things for a game is appropriate.
Especially
it is
since
interesting.
Because
it's
since
very
difficult.
There are a lot of games based on tarot, right? That are now more popular. So I'm wondering. Well, I don't know.
Well, and there is actually, so for tarot, tarot, for everyone who doesn't know, tarot originally started as a card game before it became a divination tool. So it has more roots as a game than anything than as a divination tool. So so you can get away with it, but for the Book of Changes, it was strictly a manual divination tool, but more than anything else. So it's harder to remove yourself from it, especially if you're going to use the same practice of divining, which can be very tricky.
And tarot doesn't quite have the same religious, or not it doesn't have the same tie in there, institutional tie in. It was very much like, oh, hey, I've got a bunch of playing cards. Let's see let's just figure out what's up. It's what's what. And
not as culturally significant might be I think
that's
really
grounded. It's not grounded on a specific
grounded,
culture.
Exactly.
Right.
It was such a broad thing that could be found across so many different countries.
Right, because tarot, which was the original card game, was developed in Italy, and then it migrated to France and Germany, and then it spread to England, which is why, which is where you saw the clash of old English magic and new magic coming in, which was around the late Victorian time period. So I did a lot of history for that.
So that said, we are well over time, but that's okay because I think we as a group are long overdue to just shoot the shit.
Yeah.
I think our what are our impressions of this collective sector? This is also the most we've ever gone through in one one episode.
Wow.
We went through 4
We
pages.
did good. We did good.
And I think
I'm
this new
proud of us.
format, I think this new format definitely suits us. This
Yeah.
definitely was an experiment, and I think we know like what we want to do moving forward. And I think this
Yeah.
is way better than what we were doing before.
Yeah. Great suggestion, Daniel.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't
agree.
think this
Well
was
done.
my idea. I think this was Jackie or Leanna's idea.
Probably
Great
both of us,
suggestion.
I think-
since we both kind of
'Cause we all
operate in
Say a lot of
that way.
things.
Yeah.
Sometimes
I think we all kind of like combined resources to putting this together. But yeah, I'm happy with this new format. I think it's really great, and I think that we were able to stay focused after we stopped talking about Fast and Furious, and just don't talk about that with Michelle and I because we're just
gonna go.
the thing. I think
That was technically your fault. That was your question.
that was my fault. That
Daniel.
was my
that
fault.
was your-
I think
That was your-
I honestly think the question of the day thing has to go because it's a bad idea.
it just can't, the bar topic is it cannot be about Fast and Furious.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. That said, way of work and social customs.
Oh yeah.
There
Final
were,
thoughts.
There were concepts in there that I liked.
Mhm.
Portraying a highly socially mobile culture, with kind of a case system that's a bit more, I guess, true to how it is more today, where you're sort of born into an expected social role, but you can kind of move around within that. Like, I like that conceptually. I was good with that, or at least the intent behind it. Clothing was terrible. Feng Shui was terrible. And I am again disappointed by the amount of racism and sexism and fetishization that they feel that they have to pack into every section of this book. It's exhausting. It's just, I don't want to have to keep reading this like constant barrage of prejudice and hate in some respects. It's so distracting from the idea of I'm trying to if you're trying to create a world that I want to play in, you have failed because you have made this world ugly and mean.
And also, they haven't, for me, really described the world itself. Like, this whole section was like, when they're describing something, it had to be in comparison to something else. It wasn't, here is this place and how it is. Instead, they're like, here's this place and how it's not, compared to another place that we've kind of fucked up and had our way with,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Final thing for me is I would, even though like the I Ching and everything is not part of my life and world, like that whole section, I would remove it, because they made it into a randomized fortune cookie situation where it's like, roll the dice and we'll give you like a one-liner fortune. It's like, no, don't. You're not going to do it right. Don't do it at all. Just get rid of it.
Yeah. I think the way of work section, there is some potential in there. There is certainly a lot of problem there, but I think it's the most redeemable of the stuff that we read for today. I think that, Feng Shui is like it's so profoundly bad to reduce this practice into a single third level spell that does basically nothing. I think social customs, clothing, trigrams, honestly, Sing-Song Girls, get rid of that whole thing. There is so much wrong with it. I think it's just like, especially the social customs section when it comes to clothing and the Sing-Song Girls, I think it's just so deeply like offensive, sexist, racist. I think it's just poor design in general. Like, get rid of the whole thing. Did anybody else want to add to any of this? Okay.
I guess.
Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, like, again, like, if we were going to just redo this section, I can, I think that there could be some interesting thing that could, like, I don't want to take feng shui and put this in here and like reduce it to this because this is incredibly reductivist. But I like the idea of like, well, what if we could arrange things in such a way that it like takes advantage of the chi running through the area so that your spells could be more potent? Like that could be interesting, but I don't like it here. I don't like it like this at all. I don't like it anywhere. I wouldn't like it with mouse. I wouldn't like it with house. But I just, again, I really feel like with this, with the clothing and the social customs, like there is so much potential to do this by region. And I think that when we start talking about making our own city and our own customs, like even like it, depending on how big our city is, like there could be totally like neighborhood customs and like ways of dressing and stuff like that.
I think we should just do it with a we go and do a small town.
A small town.
We have like landmarks, so we have key people, we have landmarks. We could even put like a minor history. And I think what we could do is in the month go and we could be like, okay, who wants to do it? Like I already know what I want to write. Like I want to put a restaurant there. I want to write a restaurant into the small town, and I want.
Of course you do.
Of course, right? Right. So that's what I want to do, and it's just like we'll kind of like start grabbing elements into it, and we'll put it together. We'll figure out the best tool in which we can collaborate on this, and then when we actually go through it on our next episode, we'll screen share whatever board we're working on. We'll put all of our cameras at the bottom, and we'll just collaborate on this together for 2 hours live. And maybe by the end of it, maybe by the end of 2 sessions, we have something that, you know, we can, you know, publish. And I think that's really cool. And I think it's what's really interesting is that I think we can set clear parameters. Like we want this set in, we want this maybe inspired by or analogous to this particular period in history, this particular region. This is the geography, so therefore this is the kind of food or this is the kind of stuff that they might eat. This is what they could be famous for, right? I think when we do names and NPCs, it would be important to make sure that we have like translations and context to what these names actually mean, which is something that, again, Kara-Tur very much fails at. So I think I think next episode is going to be super exciting, and we'll talk about this off air. That said, a lot of this is going to be possible because of our amazing patrons.
Yay!
And I'm super excited about our amazing patrons, especially because I get to talk about one of the most honorable of patrons today on air in front of them, because I've been waiting for this for a really long time. So shout out to, you know, our Disciples of the Sky Court, our $5 patrons, our Guardians of the Realm, Brooke Bright, Pixel Grotto, Jeremy, and Daisy May. Thank you for your $10 support. And our most honorable patrons. I wasn't going to call it the most honorable patron. I actually was going to call it something different. But one of our Discord mods, Drew, was like, Daniel, you should call it most honorable patrons. And I was like, yo, that's the best way to take this inside joke and just make it a reality. So thank you to the most honorable Ryan, the Wizard Hall. You are awesome. The most honorable Metal Weave Games. Check them out. The most honorable Dungeon Glitch / Matt. And the most honorable ×2 Epic Impulse. And the most honorable of all of them. I know you don't want me to say this. The most honorable Valorous Games / Liana. Liana, you are the most honorable of all of us right here.
Blow that honor whistle.
Thank you for your support, everyone. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. Y'all are awesome. We are 6 patrons away from having Bubble Tea Book Club be a reality, and one of our first guests is going to be Michelle on Bubble Tea Book Club. If we could get 6 more patrons of any tier before the 4th Friday of this month, we'll have Bubble Tea Book Club. And I have a suggestion for what we're going to read, and it's going to be Falling by Mahar, a game that we've talked about a lot but haven't actually read. So what we're going to do is, because of Bubble Tea Book Club, the concept is that we will buy copies of this game. It will always be an Asian creator, and it will almost always be from Itch, because that's where a lot of indie creators live. So we'll buy an indie game on Itch by an Asian creator. We will not only read it with our 2 guests, either like we're always going to aim for 2 people or 1 or 2 people, and then we'll buy them bubble tea. And we'll enjoy a beverage and another person's work live. So 6 more patrons will make that a reality. That said, Michelle, most honorable Leanna, Jackie, Emma, thank you for joining Agatha and I for episode 9 of Asians Read Kara-Tur. I am so happy we're back. And thank you everyone who supports us on Patreon, watches us on YouTube, or watches us live. Y'all are awesome. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.